Hi, I'm Alex Sudras, and welcome to tonight's Boldmethod Live IFR. We're talking about IFR alternate minimums, which I think have gotten a little bit more complicated since I originally started flying with the introduction of GPS and WAAS. So whether you're getting ready for a check ride or you're an instrument-rated pilot, and it's just been a little while since you've gone through those regs, I think you're going to find something really useful in tonight's broadcast. But first of all, I'd like to thank you. If you are tuning in tonight, you know that we've changed our schedule. Typically, this would have been on Tuesday. It's Thursday, and that's because we had an opportunity to do this. That's Swain Martin. You can see here in...
Pull it up. We can't see it.
Oh, you can't see it. Well, there you go. Now you can see. Now you can see Swain Martin in Thunderbird's F-16. And he had an opportunity to fly and film with the Thunderbirds, talking about U.S. Air Force pilot training and recruitment. And we provided the cinematography crew. So on Tuesday, we were out with Swain filming with the Thunderbirds. It was an absolutely awesome opportunity. More fun for Swain because he got to fly in the airplane. He'll be making a video on that and posting it to his YouTube channel. Swain runs a YouTube channel about airline operations. He's a new first officer on the Embraer 145. So he talks about what it's like to be an airline pilot and fly the line, and has received FAA approval to film from the cockpit in certain situations. So you can check out his channel. We have a link in the description. And if you follow our site, you know that Swain also writes with us and is involved in a lot of our production. Okay, but today we're going to talk about something a little bit more exciting, and that's IFR alternate minimums. So what we're going to do is start by talking about a little bit when an alternate is required. Okay, so the basic fuel requirements and the general weather conditions. And we're not going to spend a lot of time on that. We'll do a separate series that actually talks about, some different cross-country scenarios and then in-flight weather changes and stuff like that. But we're going to hit it quickly because that's kind of the nexus for an alternate, weather at your destination. From there, we're going to move on to how to choose an alternate that meets the FAA requirements. And so we'll talk about standard and non-standard alternate requirements and all the conditions that you can typically see and where to find that information, whether you're using Jeppesen charts or you're using FAA charts. We'll show where you'd find that information, how you can determine what would be an acceptable alternate, and then we'll also talk about how WAAS and GPS has complicated that a little bit. So if you're an instrument-rated pilot, you got your instrument rating maybe prior to the WAAS revolution or GPS, some of this stuff you may not know, and we'll kind of bring you up to speed so you can know how you can use GPS to plan for an alternate. Okay, so let's get started. We're going to start with what could be more fun, fuel planning. FAR 91.167. Everybody loves the FARs, and that basically is a nexus for an alternate. It says no person may operate a civil aircraft in IFR conditions unless it carries enough fuel to complete the flight to the first airport of intended landing, except as otherwise provided, fly from that airport to the alternate airport, and then fly after that for 45 minutes at normal cruising speed, or for helicopters, fly after that for 30 minutes at normal cruising speed. Okay, so when is that alternate required? Well, that would be the typical 1, 2, 3 rule. So for at least 1 hour before and 1 hour after the estimated time of arrival, the ceiling must be at least 2,000 feet above the airport elevation, 2,000 AGL, and the forecast visibility must be at least 3 statute miles. And there's one more gotcha here that people forget oftentimes on an oral for an instrument check ride, or if your destination doesn't have an instrument approach, you always need to file an alternate. Okay, so that last part, people go, well, that doesn't make sense. Why would you fly IFR to an airport that doesn't have an instrument approach? And a good example would be we're departing Rocky Mountain Metro in low or maybe just marginal VFR weather, or even high VFR weather, but we want to cruise up high around 16,000 feet. Helps to be on an IFR flight plan because that'll get us high enough. There's typically at least a few clouds out there, so we don't have to try to avoid them. But our destination could be in severe clear VFR, small airport in rural North Dakota that does not have an instrument approach. You can still fly IFR to that airport. You would just descend from your MEA under basic VFR minimums and land. But if the airport doesn't have an instrument approach published, either a standard approach that you would find in your typical chart packs or a special one issued to you by the FAA, you're going to need an alternate. Okay, so 1, 2, 3, hour before, hour after, 2000 AGL, 3 miles or greater, or if the airport, if your destination doesn't have an instrument approach. Okay, so that brings us to the requirements for an alternate. And that's our standard alternate minima. So we'll go back to the iPad. If the airport has an instrument approach procedure for aircraft other than helicopters, the alternate airport minima specified in that procedure, or if none are specified, the following standard minima. So for a precision approach procedure, ceiling 600 feet and visibility of at least 2 statute miles. And for a non-precision approach procedure, 800 feet and visibility 2 statute miles. Okay, and as we dive into this, you'll notice that they didn't say anything about approaches with vertical guidance here, because essentially those qualify APVs or LPVs for RNAV approaches, right? Those qualify as a non-precision approach. So really for the GA population, ILS, 602, everything else, 802, or as published. Okay, so when we talk about these alternate weather minimums, what does that mean? Well, it really comes down into, why do we even have an alternate? Essentially what the FAA acknowledges is when the weather is low, things can change. And they could quickly change bad enough that you can't land at your destination. So what they want you to do is choose an alternate where the weather minimums are significantly above the minimums for the procedure. If you think about a typical precision approach, it gets you down to 200 and a half mile visibility. And when you talk about alternate minimums, 602, well above that for standard minimums. And non-precision approaches, that's a little trickier because their MDAs can be low, or in Telluride they can be 2,000 feet. But again, the idea with the alternate minimums that are either published for the approach or standard is that the weather is significantly better, forecast to be better, than the minimums on the procedure. Okay, so what happens if you actually do divert to your alternate? Well, you don't have to use the alternate weather minimums. They're just for planning. That's it. At the moment that flight plan is filed and you've received your clearance and you're rolling off, those alternate weather minimums really don't apply anymore. And if you decide to divert to your alternate, you don't even need to fly the approach you kind of plan for. You can fly any procedure you want there, and you'll fly them down to the published minimums for your aircraft. So again, one of the big questions, especially in an instrument check ride, because this can get really confusing, is to say, okay, you end up diverting to your alternate. What minimums do you use for the procedure? You use the published minimums. The only reason the alternate minimums are higher is because the FAA is trying to give you some padding, essentially to say, yeah, well, if the weather goes bad at your destination, we don't want it to be able to go so bad at your alternate that you end up having to eat into that last 45 minutes of fuel. That also brings up a point. When we're choosing alternates, it's not just about finding somewhere that meets the requirements. It's about finding somewhere that meets the requirements. It is in a place with different enough weather that you could possibly land if you need to divert there. So one of the things that I always think about when we look at things like fog or low clouds in the Denver area, people will file an alternate of Centennial when they plan to go to Rocky Mountain Metro. That really doesn't help a lot. Centennial is only 20 miles away, less than that. So if the weather's bad at Metro, it could easily be just as bad at Centennial. So when I'm typically filing an alternate, not only am I looking to make sure that the weather meets those requirements, but I'm also trying to choose an alternate that's in a place where the weather would be significantly different. So different weather patterns. If I'm flying down the coast of Oregon, I'm typically not going to choose an alternate on the coast. I'll find something inland, or maybe past the Cascades, like Bend, because the weather is typically very different on the other sides of the ranges. And the other advantage is it gives me enough fuel that I have options. We'll get into the details on this later, but you don't ever have to divert to your alternate. In fact, if you do need to divert, you'll typically choose the airport with the best weather, and ATC will clear you there. Alternates are essentially for fuel planning and for possibly lost communications. But, you know, the idea is you're giving yourself enough gas so that if the weather goes awful, you can get to somewhere where there's good weather. Okay, I think I've beat that enough. There is one other case where you can use an airport as an alternate, and we'll switch to the iPad. If the airport doesn't have an instrument approach procedure published, you can still use it as an alternate. However, the ceiling and visibility minima need to allow you to descend from the minimum en-route altitude in that area, make the approach and landing under basic VFR. So, for example, you could choose an airport without an instrument approach, or an airport that has instrument approaches but that say ANA, alternate not authorized. So an airport that you typically couldn't use and plan for the approach, just the weather at the time of arrival at the alternate needs to be good enough to get you from the MEA down to the airport under basic VFR weather. So maybe you've got an airport on the opposite side of a mountain range where it's typically dry, forecast to be 12,000 scattered, but there aren't any procedures there. Still makes a good alternate because you can typically get down from 12,000 feet and land. And they say basic VFR. What they mean there is you can't expect to get a special VFR clearance. So essentially, you need your basic VFR weather minimums. And that applies to both towered and non-towered airports. Okay, so let's take a look at a couple examples, because what this really comes down to is looking at an airport, identifying the different approaches, seeing which approach matches your aircraft systems and capabilities and offers essentially the lowest alternate minimums. So that you would actually be able to use if you diverted there. So let's start by taking a look at an airport on the Oregon coast, or kind of central Oregon, and that's Medford. Okay, so this is the Jeppesen 10.9 page. Medford, Rogue Valley International, and you can see the airport here. And on a Jeppesen chart, excuse me, the alternate minimums appear at the bottom of the airport 10.9 page. This is also the same page that provides your takeoff and obstacle departure procedures, and typically will also contain the airport diagram, though sometimes they will split that out if there's too much information. So what you can see here, there are quite a few different approach options. I prefer Jeppesen charts. And I'll say this again, they're not a sponsor, but we buy them, Colin buys them, I have them, we have them in the airplane, airlines use them. Part of it is all of the information is typically in one place, and once you know where that is, if you're really trying to use this in the IFR system, it makes things a lot easier. But we will show an FAA version right after this. They both accomplish the same thing. Okay, so going back, for filing as an alternate, you can see what Jeppesen has done here is they have broken this up into several different places. So they've grouped procedures. Here we have the RNAV, RNPs. That would not work for us, for an airline possibly, but most GA aircraft are not equipped for RNP-based RNAV approaches. So this alternate minimum wouldn't work. Now you can see they've grouped the VOR DME runway 14 and the VOR-A, the RNAV GPS-Y for runway 14 and the RNAV GPS-D and VOR DME-C here. And then underneath each one of them, they've published the procedures alternate minimums. So if you were flying into Medford and you wanted to choose, you wanted to determine what your alternate minimums would be, you'd actually look at each of these, and then you'd step out over here and look at each of those, and you'd see which one of these procedures you could fly, considering the wind direction. If the winds are too strong of a tailwind, you may not want to plan on using the ILS. And then you would also look to make sure, okay, if I'm planning the procedures in this group, will the control tower be operating? Okay, and then you'll find the lowest minimums you can use, and that is the procedure that defines your alternate. So for example, if I'm choosing Medford and I'm going to arrive at noon, the tower will be operating. If the winds allow me to fly the ILS to runway 14 and the forecast weather at Medford is at least 700 feet AGL and 2 miles visibility, then I could plan on using Medford as an alternate. And the procedure I'm basing that on is the ILS to runway 14. Let's say the winds are too strong for me to use the ILS. Well, if I'm arriving at noon, I could possibly plan on using the localizer back course, but that requires weather minimums of 2,300 feet AGL and 2 miles. So now I can go over here and take a look. Let's see if there's anything lower here. Notice these approaches don't say authorized wind tower operating. So these approaches can be used as an alternate even if tower is closed. So I'd look for the lowest minimums that I can accept. The VORA, a circle to land, requires 1,400 feet AGL and 2 miles for a category A and B airplane, 1,403 for category C and D. And so this procedure, as long as the weather forecast at Medford at my arrival time at the alternate is at least 1,400 in AGL and 2 miles, this procedure would allow me to use Medford as an alternate. So when we're looking at this, we see all these different procedures, and the concept can be a little bit confusing. But what you really want to do is say, okay, at the time of my arrival at the alternate, what's the weather going to be? What runways can I accept landing on? What procedures can I fly? Now, let's see what procedure has the lowest alternate minimums that meets those requirements. That's the procedure that I base my planning on. Okay. Do I need to fly that procedure? No. Do I tell the FAA what procedure I use for planning? No. All the FAA is trying to do is to say, look, you need to plan based off of this worst case scenario where none of these other procedures will work. So you need to find the one procedure that you know will work with the higher published weather minimums that will get you down. But if you end up diverting to that alternate, you can fly any procedure that you're equipped and licensed to fly that's operating and available at that airport. Okay, looks like we have our first question.
Okay, good question with exactly what you're talking about here, Alex. Jim wants to know, and let's use Medford as this example, like the ILS to 1.4 with that 702. He wants to know if my alternate weather is lower than what the chart says after I take off, can I still go there?
You can. You know, the interesting thing about that is there was a time when you would have had no idea. Other than asking flight service, we would have really not known what the weather was doing once we took off. And Jimmy may know this. But, you know, now we have all kinds of information. And the reality is, once your alternate is used for filing and planning purposes. Once you're cleared and you launch, now it's useful for lost comm purposes, but you can still continue. However, one of the things that Colin and I have learned, we've never gotten ourselves in a lot of trouble, but I've definitely made myself nervous enough to where I watch the tasks throughout the flight now. We have XM weather that gets piped into the airplane, and if you don't have that, if you're down low enough, you can easily pick up cell reception. I know the FCC doesn't like it, but to update the weather and monitor that alternate, it's not a bad thing. Does that mean that you're going to change your flight plan? No. But what I am doing during flight is I'm asking myself, okay, my destination, it still looks like it's going to be bad weather when I arrive. And if my alternate also starts to look like it's bad, I'll choose another airport. I don't tell ATC about it. I just choose another airport, and that's what I'm using for my in-flight fuel computations. So, I might look at an airport that's closer to me and say, okay, you know what? If my destination doesn't start to lift, I'm going to land early. Or, I'm going to maintain a longer fuel requirement to get to somewhere that does have good weather. But to directly answer your question, if the weather changes en route, no, it's just the alternate is used for filing and planning purposes. And from there, you're kind of on the operational side of the flight. So when we look at these procedures, again, one of the tough things is it can be complicated because you're looking at so many different procedures and so many different minimums. And again, your goal is to find a procedure that you can fly, considering the winds and your aircraft's equipment, that meets the requirements. So the weather needs to be above the alternate minimums, standard or published. If there are any restrictions like tower operating or another typical one, local altimeter setting is available, it needs to meet those restrictions. And so that's what you use for planning. But if you end up diverting to your alternate, you can fly any procedure there that you're equipped and certified to fly, and you will fly that procedure to its published minimums, not the alternate minimums. Okay, back to the iPad, couple things. You'll notice there's only one standard minimum procedure here, I think, and that's the RNAV. The rest of these are all non-standard, not by much oftentimes, but the localizer is standard. But it's got a criteria here, which is authorized only when tower is operating. One advantage of a Jeppesen chart is it will show all of the procedures and list all of their minimums. So you really don't have to try to guess at anything. The FAA requirements are in the alternate minimum sections of the TERPS procedures, and we'll zoom in on that. This is what it looks like here. And so what they do is the FAA lists, oh, that's a little big, we'll make that smaller. The FAA lists each procedure that has non-standard minimums. And then they use these little numbers next to them right here to tell you what those minimum changes are. So let's start with the, let's take a look at the ILS or LOC to runway 14. And you'll notice it says 12 in the top right corner. What that means is note 1 and note 2. So the first thing we do is we go down to note 1. ILS, categories A, B, C, D. Your alternate minimums are non-standard. They're 700 feet AGL, 2 miles of visibility. Note 2, not authorized when the control tower is closed. Okay? And if we look at, like, take example, LOC DME back course, Bravo. It says 2 and 3, or 23, where really it's 2 and 3. So note 2, not authorized when control tower is closed. And note 3, categories A and B, your non-standard minimums are 2,300 feet AGL and 2 miles. Category C and D, ceilings 2,300 feet AGL and 3 miles. You'll notice that if you look up here, you won't see that RNP procedure, and you won't see approaches with standard minimums listed. So one of the problems oftentimes with the FAA minimums is it's really easy to kind of get confused when you're dealing with procedures that are both standard and procedures that are non-standard, because the FAA will not list the standard procedures in the alternate minimum section unless there's a restriction like control tower or local altimeter setting. So it can be helpful, again, on the Jeppesen charts. I like it, especially when I'm really out there planning and flying quickly. It makes it a little bit easier, but the FAA procedures get the same job done. And again, even though those alternate minimums are non-standard, if you get there, you'll fly to whatever minimums you want, whatever minimums are published, whether the towers are operating or not. You're subject now to the procedure and not the alternate requirements. Okay, there's another thing that I want to show you. We'll go back to the iPad, and that is, not only can you tell if a procedure has non-standard alternate minimums by looking at the 10.9 page on a Jeppesen chart or the alternate minimum section for the FAA, but you can also take a quick look at the FAA chart, the instrument approach chart. If you see an A in a triangle, that means that the alternate minimums are non-standard. If you see an A and A with an NA next to it, it means that the airport, this procedure cannot be used for planning an alternate. If you're looking at a Jeppesen procedure, they will not use that A indicator. That's because the 10.9 page does all the work. So on Jeppesen, that's where you'd go. Okay, let's take a look at another airport here, and that's Newport. It's got a little bit simpler alternate requirements. It divides up into 3 groups. So if you take a look here, the first group is authorized only when local weather is available. So essentially, AWAS or ASOS needs to be available, cannot be NOTAMed out of service. And that includes the VOR runway 16, 34, RNAV GPS 16 and 34. And each of those procedures all use the same group of alternate minimums. Category A is standard, 802. So if you're category A aircraft, 802. Category B aircraft is non-standard, 902, C, 1,303, and D, 1,500 feet AGL ceilings and 3 statute miles visibility. The VOR-A falls into its own group of non-standard minimums. And then any other procedure, which isn't listed here, is not authorized for use as an alternate. Okay, so let's quickly take a look at the FAA pages there. And you can see Newport down here. And so again, what they're going to do is only list the procedures with non-standard minimums. So we could take a look at the VOR-A. That would be Note 3, categories A and B, 902, category C, 1303, category D, 1503. Okay, looks like we have a question.
Okay, Dimitri's got a good question here, and you've kind of covered it here, Alex, but I think it's good to just kind of go through a little bit in more detail here. He wants to know if you've got an approach that is NA, so ANA, and maybe we can look at an example of that on an FAA chart. Does that mean just that approach is NA, so you can't use it as an alternate, or does that mean the entire airport is not able to be used as an alternate?
Okay, good question, Dimitri. And it means just that procedure cannot be filed as an alternate. So essentially, airports can always be filed as an alternate because you can always fall back to that descent under basic VFR from the MEA down to the airport. If the weather at your forecast time arrival at your alternate is good enough to allow you to descend from the MEA over the airport down to land under basic VFR, the airport can be filed as an alternate. You don't even need to plan for an instrument approach procedure. The only time you would actually need to select an instrument approach procedure or look at weather minimums on an instrument approach procedure is if you can't make it from the MEA down to the airport under basic VFR conditions. Now, that's normally the case. That's kind of how people plan. And so that's why the focus is always on alternate not authorized for this procedure or non-standard minimums. But I've got an example. Let's take a look at, this is also at Newport. It's the ILS or localizer to runway 16. And if you look at that, you'll notice in the corner, it says alternate not authorized, ANA. So this procedure cannot be used for planning when considering this airport as an alternate. And again, I know I'm probably beating this in a lot, but it really confuses people. Just because you can't use it as your planned procedure doesn't mean that you can fly it. You can't fly it when you get there. If the procedure is operational, if there are no NOTAMs prohibiting it, if you're equipped to fly it, if the weather is good enough to fly it, then that's a fine procedure to fly if you end up diverting to that alternate. And so one thing I just want to reiterate, when we're choosing a procedure and using alternate minimums, it's really just a worst case scenario. The FAA is saying, look, I know these other ones might be good enough, but you need to make sure that there is one that is going to be better than good enough. That's going to have real good minimums, that's going to, that you're equipped to fly, that we know has got the monitoring requirements and all of that so that you'll be able to land before you run out of gas. If there's another procedure once you get there that suits your needs, you're more than welcome to fly that. Okay, and you saw that ANA there. Again, if you're looking at an FAA chart, we know that this procedure, the VOR to runway 34, we know it's got non-standard minimums because there's a little A here. If there was no A, then that would mean that the airport follows standard minimums. Okay, so our last section that we'll take a look at is Telluride. This is the Jeppesen 10.9 page for Telluride, and we look at filing as an alternate. They've broken it down. There are no restrictions on towers because they're non-towered or weather or any of that. It's just broken down by procedure. So in this case, the LOC to runway 9 for categories A and B uses non-standard minimums, 2,300 feet AGL ceilings, and 2 statute miles of visibility. That needs to be the weather at your forecast time of arrival. Cat C and D aircraft, this procedure is not allowed or not authorized for alternate planning. The RNAV GPS Zulu to runway 9, category A and B 2602, category C 2603, category D not authorized. And then it goes down to RNAV GPS Yankee and the VOR DME Alpha. Each one of those have different minimums. You can see we're going here from decreasing essentially to increasing minimums. If you can fly the LOC runway 9, then and your Cat A or B, this procedure gives you your best bet. Most likely this would be what you use for planning. And if you look at the Telluride FAA chart, same thing. You can see If we're planning on the localizer to runway 9, it's note 1, categories A and B, 2302. And you can see that they have the alternate triangle indicated there. Okay, one other thing, I'm going to show you just a standard. So if you take a look at IXD, here you can see standard minimums. We've been looking at a lot of non-standard minimums. If you look at IXD, which is New Century and Olathe, the ILS runway 36, Jeppesen publishes it as 602 because it's standard. They'll also publish the LOC DME to runway 36. They'll say 802, even though it's standard. If you were to look at the FAA plate, you'll notice that they don't list the ILS or the LOC anywhere in there because they're standard. So again, one of the things I always tell people when you're moving between Jeppesen and FAA, Jeppesen lists every procedure, whether it's standard or not, and just lists the numbers. The FAA is only going to list non-standard procedures, and then ANA on the approach plate. So you really have to check both places. You have to check the FAA plate to make sure it's not alternate, not authorized. And then if it's an alternate and triangle, you have to go look it up in the minimum section to see what those minimums or restrictions are. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about GPS. Nope, looks like we have a question. We'll hit that first.
Okay, I have a question that you can kind of intertwine into all the next things that you're going to talk about. That comes from Wayne. Wayne wants to know, can I find an alternate airport that only has a GPS approach?
So, great question. And it depends on a couple things. It depends on how you're equipped, and it depends on whether or not you've got RAIM or WAAS available. And so we'll start with WAAS. And because we're starting to see more and more of the IFR fleet is WAAS capable. So because of that, and that's TSO C145 and 146, that applies to, I would say, more pilots now. If you are WAAS capable, the rules are actually pretty easy to follow. So we'll switch over to the iPad quickly. And the AIM talks about this in section 1-1-18. WAAS-based GPS usage, you may plan for an RNAV procedure at your destination and at your alternate. And when you're using alternate minimums, the standard minimums that you would use would be non-precision standard or published alternate minimums. So when we're talking about a WAAS-based procedure, as long as the procedure itself does not say alternate not authorized, you can plan on using it both as your primary procedure at your destination, and you can plan on using it as your alternate procedure if you need an alternate airport. But you would use non-precision minimums or the published standard or the published non-standard alternate minimums. So even if it's an LPV, you would either use 802 standard non-precision minimums or you would use the published non-standard minimums. Once you get there, you can fly an LPV if you've got WAAS reception and the approach is available, or you could fly an LNAV if you don't. But this, basically in the WAAS world, an RNAV procedure is just like any other non-precision procedure. So what would happen if you did not have WAAS? If WAAS was forecast to be unavailable or you were not WAAS equipped. So the TSO 129, I'm going to look that up, make sure I have the right number there.
So many numbers.
So many numbers, yes, TSO 129 or 196. And if you're going, wait, which one of these numbers am I? Look in your GPS supplement to the POH. It will tell you the certification basis for your GPS. So if you're basic GPS, or if you're WAAS equipped, but WAAS is forecast to be unavailable, all you'll have is basic GPS, you still may be able to use a GPS procedure at your alternate, but the rules are a little bit more restrictive. So non-WAAS, you're either not equipped or WAAS isn't available. You may plan on RNAV at your destination or at your alternate, not at both. So if your destination only has an RNAV procedure and you need an alternate, your alternate needs to have a non-GPS RNAV procedure, or vice versa. you must plan on non-precision alternate minimums. And your GPS must have the fault exclusion, fault detection and exclusion, or FDE, and you must have a valid RAIM computation. So RAIM needs to be forecast available at the alternate. And when you think about that, when we talk about non-precision alternate minimums in the AIM, the FAA actually dives into quite a bit of detail. They say that you can plan on alternate minimums for your GPS circling or LNAV only based minimums, or what they say is DA based off Baro VNAV. And so that brings up some questions, because that shows up with just kind of the basic GPS. People go, wait, isn't Baro VNAV, that LNAV Baro VNAV minimum line, wouldn't that be, something that relies on extra GPS services? And it doesn't. If your aircraft is Baro VNAV equipped, the VNAV portion is defined entirely by your altimeter system. It doesn't use GPS at all. GPS is just giving you lateral guidance. So the question is, how do you know if you're Baro VNAV equipped? That depends on your GPS system, and you need to look at the supplement to your POH. It will tell you if your aircraft is Baro VNAV capable. But to really distill that down, if you're down to basic GPS, you're not WAAS equipped or WAAS is forecast to be out, you can either have a basic GPS approach as your planned approach at your destination or at your alternate, and you need to use non-precision alternate minimums or the published non-standard precision or non-standard minimums for the procedure. And essentially, you need to be prepared and equipped and able to fly the circling or LNAV only approach, or you could be equipped to fly down to the LNAV VNAV DA if it allows you to use Baro VNAV and you're equipped. Okay, looks like we have a question.
Okay, Damon's got a question, and that is, with WAAS aircraft, how can I tell if I lose WAAS capabilities when I'm flying?
Good question. Typically, that'll result in an enunciation. And so on a G1000 aircraft, that would show up in the Alert Center. If you're flying with a 530 or 430W, that would show up on the unit itself. And that's how you know WAAS has been lost. Same thing as a RAIM failure. On a traditional non-WAAS GPS system, you'll typically see that flash as an alert on the unit itself, and it'll prompt you. Now, keep in mind, alternate filing, essentially RAIM needs to be available at the alternate if you're using basic GPS. WAAS can't be forecast to be out if you're planning on using WAAS. Once you launch, you don't need to tell ATC, you don't need to refile a different alternate if RAIM or WAAS fails in flight. And in fact, really, at that point in time, you're going to reevaluate your entire flight plan. And, ask yourself, okay, if I can't get to my destination, or my destination is too low weather, or I needed a GPS procedure at my destination, where else can I go? And, you may ask ATC to divert to another airport in flight. But really, again, the alternate planning, that's really only used when you're on the ground. Okay, so all of this brings up some basic things that we want to hit, and that is, when would you divert? Looks like we have one more question. I'll jump in on that first.
Okay, a little slow on the trigger there. Apologize about that. But back to alternates and ANAs. We've got a question about this. Why are some airports NA for alternate? Some of them are good airports with good approaches.
Good question. That could have to do with all kinds of things. Monitoring on the procedure. An ILS may not be monitored. And so we talk about monitoring. Essentially, ATC knows that the system is operating, and they will get an alert if it stops. Unmonitored procedures, I believe, cannot be used as alternates. Part of that is because ATC can't notify you in flight if they go down. They may have no idea. So it could be that. It could be restrictions on weather equipment. It could be restrictions on approach supplementary aids. It could be a restriction, maybe the ILS is monitored, but the procedures used for missed approach, or the nav aids used for missed approach, like a VOR or an NDB, aren't. And so therefore, essentially, ATC can't guarantee that they'll know if that procedure becomes unavailable. There could be other issues too. But again, the concept that ATC, or that the FAA is working for with alternates, is that they want to give you an out where if something goes wrong in flight, you would be able to know about it. Okay, you would know that you can't use that airport. and then you could choose different fuel planning options. Alternates are really worst case scenarios, and they put a lot of restrictions on them to make sure that if anything was to go wrong with this airport, you would generally know about it. You'd be able to receive the weather, you'd know the procedure is still available and working when you get there, and if something was to go wrong, ATC would know about it and could inform you. Okay, we got another question.
Staying along the ANA route, Jason wants to know this. Are there any situations where an airport might declare the alternate requirements void?
Sure, and that would show up in a NOTAM. So keep in mind when we look at all these minimums, if there are any NOTAMs for the procedure, those could also void the alternate requirements. So for example, if the FAA needs to raise the weather minimums for alternate requirements, they would issue a NOTAM for that. More often than not, you'll oftentimes see a procedure NOTAMed alternate not authorized. And again, that typically means that a portion of the procedure that would normally be monitored or available at ATC is no longer monitored. If you get there and it's working, no problem, you're fine to fly it. But they won't necessarily know it's working until you're flying it and telling them what's going on. So NOTAMs are kind of the big thing to watch for there. And that's why when we talk about planning, systems like Garmin Pilot or ForeFlight are so fantastic these days because you get all the NOTAMs in one place. And typically when I'm choosing an alternate, first thing I do is I'll click on the airport, look at the NOTAMs, or on ForeFlight, look at the NOTAMs at the top of the procedure, just make sure there isn't anything there that's changing the alternate requirements, and then from there, you're ready to file. Okay, so we've talked a little bit about, alternate minimums and, the published versus standard minimums, and all of these increase the weather minimums typically over the minimums required by the procedure. But we know that once you actually divert and end up at your alternate, you fly to the published minimums for the procedure. But the real question is, when would you end up going to your alternate? And we'll talk about this in depth with some scenarios later, but the reality is you do not need to go to your alternate unless you're lost comm and you can't land at your destination. And there's even a caveat there. Really, if you look at your destination and you go, wow, I can't make it in, what you want to do is find an airport that you know you can land at, that you have enough fuel to get to and land without a doubt. That probably won't be your filed alternate, especially on a long flight. You take a 4-hour flight across the country, a lot can change. So you're constantly watching the weather at airports around your destination. You're watching your fuel reserves to determine how much fuel you've got on board. And if you look at that airport and you go, wow, there's no way I'll make it in, or you try and you go missed, as opposed to just saying, okay, I'm going to head to my alternate. The first question you should ask is, what's the airport that gives me the best options? And ask for ATC to clear you there. ATC can help you find that airport if you're task saturated. And today, with XM Weather and ADS-B, ForeFlight, and cell reception, you've got a great picture at weather at your surrounding airports. Okay, the alternate is for fuel planning. It gives you a big padding. But if you need to divert, choose the airport that does the best job of getting you down. Okay, so what happens if you lost comm? There used to be a time where people say, well, lost comm is not really an emergency, but really today it kind of is. There are very few reasons why you would go lost comm in most modern aircraft. You typically have 2 radios. You typically have multiple redundant supplies of electricity from batteries to alternators. Many newer aircraft have dual alternators and dual batteries, so comm failures are becoming less and less frequent. And the problem is, if your filed alternate has great weather, then yes, ATC would expect you to go there. But if you're looking at it, you're lost comm, and you're looking at your destination, you're like, yeah, there's no way I'm going to make it in. And you're looking at your alternate and you're going, yeah, that looks sketchy too. I'm not really sure I can land there. Now you are definitely in an emergency situation. And so that's where you get to exercise 91.3, responsibility and authority of the pilot in command. If you are lost comm and your alternate just does not look like a safe option, it's responsible to choose the best option for your airplane. ATC will be watching you. They'll be clearing aircraft out of your way. Try to make it obvious where you're going to. Broadcast in the blind, fly direct to initial approach fix for that procedure. But really, lost comm today can oftentimes be an emergency. And if your alternate that you filed doesn't look like a good option, you don't want to let that put you into a scenario where you can run yourself out of fuel. Okay, looks like we have another question.
Okay, John's got a question that kind of follows up with what you just finished up talking about, Alex. He says, how about telling ATC that you're changing your alternate from filed to cover your lost comms? Is that something you'd ever do in flight?
You know, you absolutely could. And there's, especially with lost comm, it would give the FAA more knowledge about what you're going to do. So is that a bad idea? No, it's actually a fantastic idea. Is it often done? No, we don't see people doing that a lot. But the reality is it does help ATC predict what you're going to do. And so if your alternate was to start to look bad in flight, it would be a very intelligent and responsible thing to do. Tell ATC, hey, I'm switching my filed alternate to X. It definitely is a good idea. Okay, looks like we have another question.
Okay, we got time for one last one here. This is a good one from David, and this goes back to alternate airports that don't have an approach. Because it talked about how you can use those airports, but you need to descend from the MEA under basic VFR. So what David says is this. When it says descending from the MEA, what altitude are they talking about?
Great question. This goes back to that off-route MEA, which is 1,000 feet above the highest obstacle within 4 nautical miles of the course. Around the airport, you could draw a big ol' 4 nautical mile radius circle. So it's 1,000 feet AGL above the highest obstacle in that area in a non-mountainous area. In a mountainous area like Colorado or parts of Oregon, then it's 2,000 feet. So really what you could do, and I'll flip open ForeFlight here, take a look. Okay, we know that we'll choose a non-mountainous area. So I doubt Smith Center has an approach, but let's just assume it doesn't. It's not in a mountainous area. So essentially you could draw, a 4 nautical mile circle. We'll just say the highest obstacle there. I don't know, that tower looks like it's probably, that's close enough to count. So we'll say that tower is the highest obstacle. The top of the tower is 2,236 feet. So the MEA over that airport would be 3,236 feet. And then if I want to go into a mountainous area, let's take a look at, a lot of these airports, believe it or not, do have instrument approaches. Let's say you're not equipped to fly any of Steamboat's approaches, but you wanted to consider it as an alternate. Well, you'd draw that, you'd look at kind of that area around it, and we'll just say the highest thing I would choose would probably be, I know it's a little out of there, but I would say that 10,800 foot peak. You'd add 2,000 feet to that. So 12,800 feet would be the MEA for off-road operations there. And that essentially would be how you choose what the MEA is. Again, that goes back to that basic IFR off-route planning. And it's something that, it's interesting, we don't really think about it, but it's becoming more and more important now that we're using GPS-based direct navigation. You draw the 4 nautical mile buffer zone on either side of your course, so essentially a 8 nautical mile wide leg, and then the highest object on that leg, add 1,000 or 2,000 feet to it, that becomes your MEA. And it does open up airports. One of the ways I look at it is you wouldn't want to use that if the weather is close, that rule. If the weather is just above the MEA, yeah, that really doesn't help. But a good example of where that rule is very practical is, let's say you're planning on going into Metro and you're coming from the west and Steamboat's forecast to be skies clear. Well, the weather on the other side of the mountains is oftentimes very different, and skies clear will definitely get you down to land. So in that case, Steamboat would make a decent alternate. Okay, I know this is the technical side of alternates, but then looking at in-flight diversions is a completely different scenario. And everything can kind of start to change. So we'll take a look at that in another video. But in the meantime, if you have any suggestions or any topics that you want to hear about on our IFR Live, let us know. And tomorrow at midnight Eastern Time is the deadline to apply for the AOPA Cub Sweepstakes. I think they'd be a lot of fun to fly, and I think everybody would love to own a Cub. So you should absolutely get that application in, or get the registration for that sweepstakes in. And if you haven't renewed your AOPA membership, it's a good time to do so. Thanks for tuning in tonight, and we hope to see you in 2 weeks. Good night.